recording.
Okay.
Okay, so
Vasiliki, just hold on, I'm introducing you. So today we have, welcome everybody. We have Vasiliki Skreta, who is going to present information design by an informed designer with Frederic Koessler. Frederic is also here and he'll be manning the chat, let's say. We have two guest panelists, which we're very pleased to have here, Simone Galperti and Thomas Troeger. Thank you for joining us. The format of the seminars, as you probably already know, it's 60 minutes. Panelists are encouraged to ask questions. We encourage the audience to ask questions in the chat. There'll be a 15 minutes session for question and discussion at the end. Please keep your microphones muted during the talk. But again, feel free to use the chat. Let me remind you that the talk is recorded. And before I hand over to Vasiliki, let me remind you that we meet every week on Thursdays at 4 p.m. UK time. Next week, the presenter will be Meg Meyer from Oxford. She'll present welfare analysis of a steady state model of observational learning with Esther Cabos. And as guest panelists, we'll have perennial favorite Nagieb Ali and Peter Sorensen. As usual, you can find more information on our website or by following us on Twitter. The recording is going to be on YouTube. And thank you, Vasiliki. The microphone is yours.
well, thank you all for organizing this outstanding seminar series and for giving us the opportunity to present this work. The title is, the title is Information Design by an Informed Designer, which is joint work with Frederic Koessler. And I don't think we could have better panelists than Simone and Thomas discussing this work. So thank you both to Simone and Thomas for agreeing to join today. We are very grateful. It's not difficult to convince you, I think, that decisions or economic outcomes crucially depend on the information agents have, and that's the case both in decision theoretic settings and in strategic settings. For example, we make decisions on whether to vaccinate or not based on the information we have, or team members as part of an organization working to launch a new project, their effort on the project crucially depends on what information they have about the innate probability of success of the project, and perhaps also about the productivity or work ethic of their team members. So information is crucial, and there is an important and fast-growing and very influential literature that studies information design. So in those papers, there is some party that we call the designer that chooses an information structure for a set of agents. So simply put, the designer chooses who gets to know what, and the objective is to influence their decisions according to some objective function. So in the information structure is usually modeled as an experiment, which is a mapping from the state of the world. So a state of the world sort of summarizes what is the information, and the mapping maps each state of the world to a probability distribution over signals. And it's possible that each agent observes a private signal realization. So this formalism is analogous to a generalized principal agent problem first formulated by Marison in 1982, but there is a crucial difference. The difference is that there are no informational constraints. So the mapping from the state of the world is sort of known. You cannot fake the state of the world in the experiment. So the designer chooses this function from state of the world to distributions over signals, and there are no informational incentive constraints to elicit information. So in other words, the mediator implementing this mechanism is omniscient. And information design induces an outcome that has been called a Bayesian solution, or more recently, Bayes correlated equilibrium. And in the special case where we have a single decision maker, the information design is often called Bayesian persuasion, following the terminology of the seminal paper by Kamenitsa and Gensko. And this idea that the information that players have is going to be crucial and crucially affecting equilibrium outcomes in a game appeared early on in works on repeated games by Oman and Maschler, where they formulated this problem of information design as a splitting of a prior, and the solution, they formulated the solution by concavifying the designer's value function. So the information design or Bayesian persuasion is often interpreted as a situation where in which a sender commits to disclosure strategy or the experiment, as I was saying a minute ago. And as I said again, the designer has no informational incentive constraints. So under this interpretation, there is a sender who is able to choose and commit before observing the state, this information disclosure rule or statistical experiment. And this is what we call in this paper ex-ante information design, to contrast it with what we're doing here, where we are going to study a designer who has private information when choosing the information disclosure policy. So this is why we call this interim information design. The designer is choosing an experiment as in the Bayesian persuasion literature, but instead of choosing the experiment before knowing the state, the designer does so after observing the state. This is similar to what is going on in chip dog games, notably in the seminal paper by Crawford and Sobel. In that game, a privately informed sender sends a message to the receiver, but the sender there sends only chip messages. In particular, submits only a single message. What is going to be different in our paper is that while our sender is informed, they can choose any experiment. So this is also different from the literature on that studies disclosure games. For example, Myerson 81. There, the sender has evidence and chooses this deterministic disclosure of evidence. It's going to be similar in our setting compared to the games with evidence is both that the designer is choosing the experiment while informed, and second, that the designer cannot lie about the information he has in the experiment. So the designer's interim incentives differ from his ex-ante incentives. For example, a high-quality seller prefers information to be disclosed, but a low-quality or perhaps an uninformed seller may not want information about the good to be disclosed. And also, when we are having information design at the interim stage, the mere choice of the experiment itself may reveal information about the state of the world. For example, a customer can update his expected valuation for a product if the producer designs product testing procedures that have a low probability of uncovering bad characteristics, or if some characteristics of the product are not tested at all. So if someone tells you nothing about something obviously important, then you might start to get suspicious. So interim information design is not a constraint optimization problem, but a signaling game similar to an informed principal problem a la Myerson. The similarity of an informed principal problem is that now we're choosing essentially a mechanism. The mechanism might not have contractual outcomes, might be just action recommendations, but that's essentially a mechanism, and that's the formulation we're going to be following in this paper. So the seller example I alluded to is one of the settings where you can imagine that the person who is designing the informativeness of a process has private information. For example, let me kind of push more the seller example. Nowadays, sellers offer trial periods, give free samples to people on Instagram, or they republish safety tests they perform. And they choose all of these procedures, having a pretty good idea about the strengths and weaknesses of their product. And similarly, pharmaceutical companies or experimental labs might have done some preliminary testing before they decide to go for the fully blown clinical trials. and so forth. So I don't want to kind of bore you with a bunch of examples, but I think it's natural to think that in many settings, while in many settings the commitment assumption is a useful and natural benchmark, in other settings, the assumption that information disclosure is chosen at the interim is plausible and should be taken seriously, because the predictions maybe from ex ante, from something chosen at ex ante, may be not robust. So the literature that we relate to are, of course, the papers on information design. I'm not going to do justice on this paper because I would need like many pages. So I'm just naming a few papers. We are also relating to the literature on informed principle, and mostly to papers that study informed principle problems where the designer cannot lie about their type in the mechanism. And the first paper, to our knowledge, that studies informed principle with verifiable types is a paper by De Glippel and Minelli. And Frederic and I also have a paper where we study an informed principle problem, in particular informed seller problem with transfers, where the seller's information is hard evidence. We are also relating to a small but slowly growing literature on interim Bayesian persuasion. The majority of those papers looks at models with binary states and actions. And many papers, like also the paper by Perez-Richet, focus on equilibrium refinements. And also a lot of those papers impose constraints on the disclosure policies that the designer can choose from. So the designer in many papers does not have access to the full set of experiments. And this is interesting for other reasons than the ones we're going to be looking at in this paper. So in this paper, what we're doing is we're looking at a general model of interim information design. We're going to have multiple agents, multiple actions, arbitrary number of states, and we're going to allow for general information policies. That means that the signals that the designer discloses to agents can be private or public, depending on what it turns out to be optimal. And what we do is we define an intuitive class of incentive feasible mechanisms, which we call interim optimal mechanisms. So the definition of our interim optimal mechanism relies only on thinking about what is incentive compatible, and it's possible, of course, to consider what is incentive compatible for alternative beliefs, because this is going to matter when we're thinking about deviations. So what I'm saying here, of course, it might not make a lot of sense right now, but I will give a couple of examples in just a second, and all of these words I'm saying will start to become more specific within a context. So there are two main results in the paper. First of all, we define this concept. The first result is an existence result. We show that an interim optimal mechanism always exists. So we don't impose extra assumptions on actions, types, utilities, and so forth. And an interim optimal mechanism is an equilibrium of the interim information design game. And by equilibrium, we mean it's something equivalent to perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And we also have comparisons with some solutions, concepts of the informed principle literature. I will not have time to go through these comparisons in detail during the talk, but I just want to say that our concept is intimately related to concepts of a stronger constrained Pareto optimal outcome defined by Masking and Tirol in 1990. In our setting, SUPO is an equilibrium but may fail to exist. Our concept is also related closely to the strong neologism proof outcome defined by Milovanov and Troeger in 2012 and also further studied in 2014. S&P is an equilibrium in our game but may fail to exist. Core is also related to our notion. Core of Meyerson always exists but may fail to be an equilibrium. So in our setting, which basically we have essentially moral hazard actions, because the information designer is disclosing information and then agents can just choose whatever they want. Our interim optimal mechanisms exist and our equilibrium of the interim game. And the last part of the results are going to investigate under which conditions an ex-ante optimal information design turns out to be interim optimal as well. So it's nice. Ex-ante information design is beautiful because we have all of those papers that can help us characterize what is the ex-ante information, what is ex-ante optimal experiment. And it turns out that in many well-studied settings in the literature, actually an ex-ante optimal experiment turns out to be interim optimal. But of course, that's not always the case, and there are important cases when that's not always the case, and that's why, it makes sense to study this problem, I think. So this is a...
Vasiliki, can I briefly interrupt you? So just about the previous slide, can you put us into a little bit of a better perspective with respect to where you are going? I mean, if you have a signaling game and there are typically these many equilibria, then we are typically not satisfied with just having an equilibrium. I mean, either we want to characterize all equilibria in a reasonable class of perfect Bayesian equilibria, or somehow we want to find the most attractive equilibrium according to some refinements. So it seems a bit you're doing neither of the two. You are just saying there is this new concept that I'm proposing, and I'm showing that an equilibrium of that kind exists. And I mean, that's a very nice thing to do. But I mean, are you really thinking of going further, characterizing all kinds of interim optimal equilibria in a future paper? Or I mean, how should I think about the grander program here?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I thanks a lot for asking. Our concept, first of all, this game has a lot of equilibria, and some of them are not very natural. And our notion of interim optimality will impose some. It has a flavor of a refinement, and it will not allow for too much craziness in the beliefs. In particular, I think, to be honest, Thomas, I think I can answer your question best after I give you the definition of interim optimality.
Thanks,
because
Sue.
you will
Yeah.
you will actually there see what are the beliefs we allow for, and you will realize that basically the concept is imposes some structure of niceness in the beliefs. In particular, I can tell you in words, according to our definition, something is going to be an equilibrium if there is no deviation to an alternative disclosure rule that is incentive compatible for a belief that is incentive compatible for some belief and gives strictly higher payoff to all types on the support of that belief, according to which this mechanism is feasible. So basically, if something is not interim optimal, that means that there is a group of types that can deviate on an alternative mechanism, and there is a belief that puts positive probability only on this group of types that strictly benefit from the alternative mechanism, and the alternative mechanism is feasible for that belief. So that is the concept, and I think I'll do it more justice when I give you the formal definition. But the next example is going to start hinting on this. Is this an adequate response to, you feel like you know more now where we're going or not?
I will wait. Thank you.
So basically, we are not getting just a one line. We're not getting the entire set of PBs. We are getting a reasonable subset of PBs, and something that we think is reasonable. And let me give you this example that will start reflecting the flavor. So this example, there is a single agent only, and can choose three actions, action 0, 2, and 3. And there are two states of the world, T1 and T2, that the designer knows. The prior that the state is T1 is 1/6. So here, if the agent knew that the state is T1, the agent will get, in this matrix, the second number is the agent's payoff. And the agent, basically what the agent does in our game, as a function of their beliefs, they choose an action. If they knew the state is T1, the agent will choose action A3 because they get 3. If they knew the action is T2, the agent will choose action A0 because they choose, they get 3 in that case. And as a function of a posterior belief Q, where Q denotes the probability of T1, then the agent would choose A0 if the posterior is, or the belief is 1/3. They will choose A2 if the belief is between 1/3 and 2/3, and they will choose A3 if the belief is above 2/3. Notice here that in this example, the designer has a state-independent ranking of the actions. So both designer types not only have there's not only state-independent ranking, they get exactly, both types of the designer get the same payoff. 0 from action 0, 2 from action 2, and 3 from action 3. So if you like, in the terminology of Lipnowski and Ravin, this is an example with transparent motives. In this example, the designer wants to convince the agent that the state is T1, so they can choose A3. Because that way, both designer types get 3. But so on this plot, we are plotting the value function of the designer as a function of a belief of the agent. And as I was telling you, the payoff of the designer will be 0 if the belief is below 1/3. It will be 2 if the belief is above 1/3 and below 2/3. And it will be 3 if we are basically sufficiently convinced that the type is T1, so the belief is above 2/3. And if we have a prior of 1/6 here, we know that the ex-ante optimal allocation or mechanism is going to induce a splitting of this prior to 2 posteriors, one posterior at 0 and one at 1/3, and the payoff of the designer is going to be 1 here. This is not possible at the interim stage, and it's not going to be interim optimal. Why? Because now, if you're choosing this experiment at the interim stage, T1 will choose a fully revealing experiment and will get a 3. So in particular, you cannot have an interim optimal allocation here that gives less than 3 to type T1. So let me go and connect with Thomas' question. T1 now can deviate on their own, propose a fully revealing experiment, and that's a deviation. Why? Because with any belief that puts a probability more than 2/3 on T1, or in particular even probability 1 on T1, that deviation, that everything is feasible. The fully revealing experiment is feasible in any case, regardless of the belief, because it will fully reveal the state, and then the agent will choose action A3. So this is a deviation by T1, and that tells us that this ex-ante optimal splitting is not interim optimal. So in particular, if you are more algebraic, we are basically algebraically describing here the ex-ante optimal experiment. And the ex-ante optimal experiment, what it does, it recommends action 0 with probability 0 if the state is T1, and action A2 with probability 1. And if the state is T2 with probability 3/5, the recommendation is A0, and with probability 2/5, the recommendation is A2. And the posterior beliefs after those recommendations are going to be, after recommendation of 0, the belief that the state is T1 is 0, because A0 is never recommended when the state is T1. And if the recommendation is A2, the posterior is 1/3. So this experiment induces the required splitting we had here. And the interim payoffs for the designer at this experiment, what type T1 is going to get? Type T1 is going to be getting always action 2 So type T1 is getting 2. Type T2 is going to be getting action 2 with probability 2/5. So this is their payoff. And with the prior of 1/6, the ex-ante utility is 1. And I want to pause here because when we do ex-ante information design, what we care about is the ex-ante payoff of the designer. We don't really pay too much attention at the interim payoff vector. When we're thinking about an informed principle, the interim payoff vector is crucial because these are the payoffs that the designer at the interim stage is facing when thinking about deviating from this experiment to something that potentially could lead to something better. In particular, this experiment is not an interim solution because, as I was saying before, type T1 can get a utility of 3 by disclosing the state with probability 1 and thereby inducing action A3. So in this example, an interim optimal allocation, it's going to be an incentive compatible allocation. Allocation here, we are referring to a vector of utilities that results from a mechanism. So it's going to be an incentive compatible allocation giving 3 to type T1 of the designer. And we have multiplicity. So we have many interim optimal allocations ranging. So type 2 can be getting anything from 0 to 3/10. And in the best interim optimal allocation from the ex-ante perspective, the ex-ante payoff is 3/4. So you see here that there is a tension between what is ex-ante optimal and what is interim optimal. Ideally, the designer would like to commit to this ex-ante because that gives an ex-ante utility of 1, but at the interim stage, that's not possible. T1 requires to get 3. And of course, this example has only 2 types, but if you have more than 2 types, this idea generalizes because now we have to think about what T1 can get together if they group together with T4, or what T3 can get if they group together with T6 and T7 and so forth. And that is what is underlying interim optimality. Something is interim optimal if it's robust to deviations by coalitions of types that basically get something that is feasible and what they get is strictly better for every type on the support of the belief according to which this deviation was feasible. So this will become hopefully clear when I show you the formal definition.
Vasiliki, just very briefly. So it's a very nice and impressive example, and also confusing if one sees it first time. I mean, I'm intrigued by this example. So it's just, I mean, your terminology, I see, that's kind of, for this example, it's completely overblown because there's no IC constraint in that example, right?
Oh, thanks. Yes. So we are using the terminology incentive compatibility to encompass incentive compatibility in the generalized setting of Meyerson, which includes both informational constraints and obedience constraints. So here, whereas we don't have, thanks a lot, Thomas, whereas we don't have informational constraints for the designer, we have obedience constraints for the agent. And this is the sense we're using incentive compatibility. Does this make sense now?
Yes.
Yes, I should, yes.
Sorry, quick question. If you were to solve this problem as Lipnowski and Ravid, with your prior, the payoff would be 0, right?
Yes.
Just to compare your solution or your relaxation of commitment with their relaxation of commitment.
Exactly. Actually, I had that and I took it off. So the chip talk equilibrium here would be something, a flat line of 0. Exactly. Yes. Yes. They don't have experiments in their problem. And we have experiments, but we're doing it at the interim stage.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the questions. Yes, so whenever I talk about incentive compatibility in this presentation, thanks to Thomas' question, I now can be clear that we mean obedience constraints. We mean basically that when you get a recommendation of A0, you want to follow the recommendation and so forth. And in the formulation of the experiment I was doing here, I was already imposing anticipating the revelation principle. That's why I was equating signal realizations with action recommendations. Okay, so the kind of a few remarks that come out from this example is that at the interim optimal, at the interim, every principal type must obtain at least as much as full information, because in this setting where our designers types are verifiable, every type of the designer can deviate to disclosing fully the information and at that point they're going to get some payoff. And one of the results we have in the paper is that if we had an example of this class with transparent motives, but only 2 actions, then we would have equivalence of ex ante and interim optimality. So what basically upsets what upsets the interim optimality of the ex ante optimal mechanism here is the presence of action A3. In particular, if we had that picture and we didn't have that top, if we didn't have the third action and we were stopping at 2 and we didn't have this part, then we would not have any problems. And that's actually true more generally, as we're going to show, with 2 actions and transparent motives, ex ante optimal is interim optimal.
Sorry, Vasiliki, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, of course.
If the prior here is above, what's that, a third?
Yes.
Then ex ante and interim are the same?
Yes, and exactly. And here, and that's why what we have here, you are anticipating my next comment, that this third action creates a conflict for low priors.
Okay.
If we had a higher prior, we would not have the conflict. So it's not necessarily that many actions will upset an ex ante optimality, but it's possible that it does. And, this type of extreme actions where you need to basically high enough probability to achieve a very high action also kind of play some role in another paper by Lipnowski and Ravid, the one with weak institutions, where basically there are some situations where being able to generate extreme beliefs is useful because you can get these very high actions.
Thank you.
This is a parenthesis. So now, of course, I was saying here that with transparent motives and 2 actions, we get that an ex ante optimal mechanism is interim optimal, but that does not mean, in general, that with 2 actions or even with 2 states, we get an ex ante optimal to be interim optimal. So here is an example that is with 2 states of the world and 2 actions where an ex ante optimal mechanism is not interim optimal. So here in this example, if let Q denote the probability that the agent, again, there is only one agent, and the agent is choosing either A1, A2, depending on their belief about the state of the world, which is the type of the principle. So here, if the belief is below a half, the agent is going to choose action A1, and the principal is going to get 3 when their type is T1 and 0 otherwise. And if the belief is above 1/2, the optimal action for the agent is to choose action A2. In this, if we have a prior of 3/4 here, an optimal splitting is to split, to induce a posterior of 1/2 with probability 1/2 and a posterior 1 with probability 1/2. In that case, we get to maximize the probability with which action A1 is chosen. And that's the corresponding experiment. So here, new here in our notation is the mechanism or the experiment. We are aware that new in many papers is used to denote beliefs. We opted to follow the same notation as the papers in Meyerson because the connection to those papers of informed principle is more substantial here. So we wanted to keep the connection as the terminology as close as possible to Meyerson. So new here is the mechanism or the experiment, which recommends action A1 when the state is T1 with probability 1/3, and action A2 with the remaining probability. And when the state of the world is T2, their experiment recommends action A1 with probability 1. And this gives us the distribution of posteriors that we desire, a posterior of 1 and a posterior of 2, depending on which was the recommendation. Now, the ex-ante optimal payoff vector is type T1 gets 1 and type T2 gets 0. And it's very easy to see that this is not even a Nash equilibrium of the game where the designer chooses experiments. And here I'm just going to argue that it's not interim optimal. So it's not interim optimal according to our definition because there is a deviation to another mechanism. So I know I've been talking a lot. So this is an important point because now I'm going to tell you a new mechanism, and we are going to compute the payoff vector corresponding to this mechanism. And I'm going to argue that this mechanism is going to be feasible, incentive compatible for a range of beliefs. And the argument is going to be such that, well, this mechanism is incentive compatible for a range of beliefs, and these actually beliefs will be is interior, and the resulting payoff vector is such that both designer types are strictly better than what is ex-ante optimal. So how does this mechanism look like? This mechanism recommends action A1. When the state of the world, it recommends action A1 with probability 1/2 and action A2 with probability 1/2, so 1/2. And when the state of the world is T2, it recommends action A2 with probability 1 minus epsilon and action A1 with probability epsilon. This mechanism yields a payoff of 1.5 to T1 and epsilon to T2. So it yields strictly higher payoff compared to mu for both T1 and T2. And this mechanism is incentive compatible if the belief of the agent is between 0 and 2/3. So for example, if the designer deviates to nu and the off-path belief is 1/2, this mechanism is feasible. And this will mean this is not an equilibrium of the interim game. There are easier deviations to show that this is not an equilibrium. I'm going through this a little bit more elaborate deviation because this gives you a flavor of how we check whether something is interim optimal or not.
So, Vasiliki, for that particular construction, you could use many of the other equilibrium concepts in the literature as well, right?
Of course.
I'm just making sure. So you could also use the core, for example, and the strong neologism proofness.
Yes, core. Yeah. So yes, we could use a strong neologism proofness here. We could use. I even said it's not even a Nash equilibrium. It's not an equilibrium with this one.
Okay.
So many, and in particular, because you mentioned core, actually 1,0 is in the core. And this is why I was saying, so the vector 1,0, which is the ex-ante optimal vector, the one that corresponds to mechanism nu for this prior 3/4, is an element of the core. So both the vectors 1,0 and 0,1 are core.
Thank you very much. So this is important. So this is a crucial difference now from the core concept already that you're showing us.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, and that's the thing, that as I mentioned in the yes, the core exists, but it's not an equilibrium always. Whereas we are going to be selecting here only 0, 1, which is interim, optimal, and an equilibrium. Yes. So I hope these two examples kind of give you a flavor of what is going on. So just to sum up, even ex-ante optimal allocations may not even be in equilibrium with two actions and two states. When we have transparent motives, we need additional actions and low priors. And now we're going to go to a model that is general. So we're going to be basing our model to a Bayesian incentive problem. So this is an input in our game, and it's the same thing. Basically, it's a simpler version of the things that you see in Meyerson's papers. There are n+1 players. The designer is player 0, and there are n agents. T is a finite types, is a set of types for the designer. These are the states of the world. We call them T, not omegas, again, to be closer to Meyerson. The prior P is a distribution over types. It belongs in delta T. AI is a finite set of actions for agent I. A is the set of action profiles, and UI of A, T is the utility of player I given T and A. So the utility can depend on the entire vector of actions and the state of the world, and that can be true both. This is can be true for both the designer and the agents. For the designer, we use the index 0. So we are interested in perfect Bayesian equilibrium of the following game. Nature selects the type according to the prior. The designer privately observes the type, and then chooses a mechanism, which is a mapping from types to distributions over X. So X is Xi. Is a product over Xi. So Xi is a set of private signals for agent I. Of course, it's possible that the set of private signals is the same for all agents, but we want to be flexible because in many games, they're not going to be the same. Agents publicly observe the mechanism, and each agent chooses their strategy. So the strategy of an agent is how they're going to be responding to each signal realization. So an agent knows the experiment, knows what anticipates what they're going to be observing, and for each signal realization, they choose a distribution over actions. So the strategy of the agent is a mapping from Xi to distributions over actions. And that determines the probability that he's going to choose action AI as a function of their signal. So after the signals are realized, the signals are realized according to probability nu, given the true state of the world, which is something that the designer already knows. But at this point, the designer cannot lie about the state of the world in the experiment. The designer only chooses the experiment. So this is another difference from Lipnowski. In Lipnowski and Ravid, you could say whatever you want because you are basically saying cheap talk. Here, you're choosing an experiment and you cannot lie in the experiment. So this extensive form is like a standard information and mechanism design game if we did not have stage 2. Basically, the selection was happening ex ante. And as I was saying before, interim information design is like an informed principal problem with the omniscient mediator, verifiable types. Why? Because the designer cannot lie in the experiment. So in the case where we had only one agent, the mechanism coincides with the statistical experiment, as we know from the papers that study Bayesian persuasion with one receiver. So the definition of equilibrium is, the formal definition is an expectational equilibrium, and that it has the same spirit of sequential equilibrium. PB is not defined for this class of games, but it's basically capturing this expectational equilibrium, capturing the same idea of sequential rationality. Excuse me. But we can simplify a lot the analysis by invoking two important results from Meyerson 83. So first of all, along the equilibrium path, by the revelation principle and the inscrutability principle, we can without loss of generality, assume that the designer chooses type independent, direct, incentive compatible mechanisms. So let me go slowly here. The revelation, let's talk about first the revelation principle. The revelation principle tells us that we can, without loss of generality, equate signals with action recommendations. And we can also focus attention to mechanisms that are incentive compatible, so that basically it's they satisfy obedience constraints. So action recommendations are followed in equilibrium. This is the revelation principle in this setting where we have moral hazard constraints, if you like. And the inscrutability principle says that without loss of generality, we can have all designer types choose the same experiment along the equilibrium path. So this is only along the path. Off the path, we cannot restrict attention to direct mechanisms. And of course, the types will deviate as they wish. So under obedience, if we have a direct mechanism in obedience, the designer's interim expected utility is given some mechanism nu is given from this formula. So remember, U naught was the designer's utility, and it depended on A and T. The mechanism now that the designer chose will recommend with probability mu, with probably mu A of T, mu A given T. That's the probability that recommendation A happens when the state is T. So we sum up over all A's that are recommended with positive probability at that state of the world, and that gives us the interim utility of the designer under obedience.
Vasiliki?
Yes.
Can I ask you a clarifying question? So if I were to compare the informed principle problem of Meyerson with what you guys are doing, is the only difference that here the principal doesn't have to report her type to the mechanism? And there is no contractible action of the principal, but that's a separate thing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, so this setting is simpler from Meyerson's setting because we don't have to elicit the information from the designer.
And if you were to allow the elicitation of the designer and make it incentive compatible, would you get Lipnowski Ravid?
No, we can get more because we have experiments.
Okay, thank you.
And in certain settings, yes, we can get more, and in some cases it won't matter. So, for example, there is a large class of informed principal problems where there are incentive constraints for the principal, but they don't matter. And these are the ones that are called private value settings with transfers. So Maskin-Tirol in 1990 and other papers that study private values, you will see there that basically the principal's incentive constraints don't impose any material constraints to the problem. And we are in another setting where the incentive constraints of the principle does not impose further constraints to what is feasible, because we don't allow them, but we would get more, yes. Okay, so now of the equilibrium path, as I said, the mechanism that need not have to be a direct mechanism. So the mechanisms will have these signal realizations, and based on those signal realizations, there will be some best response of the agents. And eventually, this is going to implement some mapping from states of the world to distributions over actions. And we could calculate the interim utility vector corresponding to a deviation. This, what I just said in these two sentences in words, requires some formulas to be written down. I don't want to write more formulas here, but just believe me that when there is a deviation to a mechanism of path, that mechanism will have the signals will induce some best response from the agent, and then the overall mapping from states to actions will induce a vector of payoffs. And we will say that something is an equilibrium, a mechanism is an equilibrium of the game, if for every possible deviation, we can find some belief and a continuation equilibrium utility vector, which of course depends on this belief, because once there is a deviation, there is some belief, there is some equilibrium play given this belief. This results to an allocation vector. And to show that something is an equilibrium, we have to be able to find a belief that works for each deviation in the sense that it gives lower utility, interim utility for all types of the principle. So if something is an equilibrium, it cannot, for every deviation, we can find some belief to make that deviation unprofitable, in other words. So that's what we call equilibrium. Now, incentive compatibility, maybe I should have put this earlier, but I wanted first to focus on the new thing, which is the game. That was my thinking. Incentive compatibility in our formulation means obedience. And now after Thomas' question, I know that I should have put in this at the beginning of the talk. So what we mean, does it mean for mechanism to be incentive compatible for the agent here? It means that if the mechanism has a recommendation AI, and assuming all the others are following the recommendations, A minus I, then choosing AI versus choosing to deviate to AI prime gives you more payoff. And that's true for all possible recommendations and possible alternative actions, and that's true for all agent I's. Right. So this definition of incentive compatibility, as you see, depends on the prior, on the belief we're using. So this is what it means for a mechanism to be incentive compatible with the prior belief they have at the principle, about the principle. And remember, what is the Inspirability Principle means here is that along the path, after seeing the mechanism proposal, the agents have a belief that is equal to their prior, because the same mechanism is proposed by every designer type. I hope this makes sense, right? In general, though, when there is a deviation, we need to have this definition for any belief. So we say mu is Q incentive compatible if and only if it's incentive compatible for some common belief Q. So I was asked what is the difference between Meyerson 80. So compared to Meyerson 82, I think the difference is clear because we're doing it from principle. Compared to Meyerson 83, Simone asked me what was the question. The difference, the mediator here is omniscient, so they know T, they cannot lie, so there are no incentive compatibility conditions for the designer. And what we define here as being an incentive compatible mechanism is what Forrest called Bayesian solution, and what Bergman and Morris call Bayes correlate equilibrium.
Vasiliki, you have 5 minutes. We can go a little bit longer if you
Oh
will.
my God, sorry, I got so slow. Okay, so the definition of ex-ante optimality is, I didn't pay attention to the time at all, I should have. So an ex-ante optimality is what we know. So let me say that formally the definition of interim optimality. A mechanism is interim optimal, which is the definition of the notion. This is the important concept. A mechanism is interim optimal if and only if it's incentive compatible. So in the sense I just defined, and there is no blocking mechanism nu and belief Q such that nu is incentive compatible given the belief Q, and the interim utility of type T from nu is strictly more than the interim utility from nu for every type in the support of Q. And that is an important qualification. So beliefs, coming to Thomas' question, must be credible. So they assign positive probability only to types that strictly benefit from the alternative mechanism. So they have this property of credibility. Only types that strictly benefit are assigned positive probability. And the first theorem, it's if mu is an interim optimal mechanism, it is a perfect Bayesian equilibrium of the interim information game. And to prove this result, we formulate an auxiliary game, a fictitious n+1 extensive form game that depends on the mechanism we want to show that is interim optimal and potentially any deviation. And the proof argues by contradiction. Says, suppose mu is interim optimal but not an equilibrium, we were going to get a contradiction. Yes. So in this fictitious game, the designer type, the player 0 chooses T's, and then based on the choice, actions are chosen according with probability nu. And after each player is privately informed about the recommendation AI prime and then choose an action AI. The payoff to player 0 is given by this difference of U naught of given an action profile minus U naught of what they get at the mechanism that we are supposing is interim optimal. And the payoffs of the other agents are the same as in the original game. This game is a finite game, so it has an equilibrium in behavioral strategies. The player 0 is could be choosing a distribution over types. These are the player 0's action. And then these other players choose their strategy, what action they're going to choose based on an action recommendation. And let gamma be a continuation equilibrium profile of strategies for the agents, given the strategy of the principal. The expected payoff of player 0 in this case is equal to this expression, where we're using this line here, and the strategy of the gamma. And then by the revelation principle, this is some Q incentive compatible mechanism. And if we had a set of types that strictly prefer T compared to what they are getting from nu, and this set is non-empty, then the strategy of the principal in this fictitious game would be to put positive probability only on those set of types, because that gives the biggest payoff. You want to maximize this expression. And then we're going to get we're going to get a mechanism that is feasible with Q. And it makes all the elements in the support of Q strictly positive. So that would contradict the interim optimality, which means that S is empty. So we have that this condition is true for every type of the principal. And this we can do for any deviation nu. So if in the information design game, for every type of the designer, the deviation from nu to nu is not profitable for the designer. So we have that nu is an equilibrium. So Francesco, is it because I had a lot of questions during the talk, can I take 3 minutes?
You can take 5 if you want. We can shorten the other bit.
Yes, because there was a lot of discussion during the presentation.
That's fine, that's fine.
Thank you. Thank you for your generosity. Okay, so this shows roughly how we prove that an interim optimal allocation is an equilibrium allocation. And then we show that for every Bayesian incentive problem, there exists an interim optimal mechanism. And this proof relies on the idea of defining interim optimal allocations in terms of blocked allocations. Blocked allocations is basically, we are going to define interim optimality in terms of properties that it imposes on the interim the payoff vector of the interim payoff vector of the designer. So this is what is an allocation. So actually, this proof, what we do is we show that these blocked allocations that correspond to interim optimal mechanisms satisfy the 4 axioms of neutral optimum in Meyerson, and then we can conclude that an interim optimal allocation is a neutral optimum, and it exists because neutral optimum exists. So here for the existence result, we leverage the existence of neutral optimum, and we prove that that interim optimal mechanisms, when we define them in terms of blocked allocations, satisfy all the axioms as laid out by Meyerson in 1983. So the first axiom I'll talk about more about the first axiom because is an important axiom. The first axiom it says that if something is a strong solution, it should not be blocked. So a strong solution is something that is exposed incentive compatible. So it's incentive compatible no matter what the agent thinks, and it's not weakly dominated. So a strong solution exists in a game if and only if the exposed optimal mechanism is undominated. So let's go back to the information, to the Bayesian persuasion literature. For example, if it turns out that the ex-ante optimal experiment is full disclosure, this is a strong solution. And what does it mean to define interim optimality in terms of blocked allocations? So the set of blocked allocations that corresponds to interim optimal mechanisms are utility vectors. So there are vectors in RT such that there exists a belief Q and a QIC allocation such that U prime of T is bigger than U of T for every T in the support of Q. So U of T then is blocked because there is some mechanism that gives more payoff to all types in the support of T. And an allocation U is an interim optimal allocation if it's incentive compatible and not blocked. So I don't have time to go over all axioms, but basically I told you the proof of the idea. The important axiom is to verify that if a mechanism is a strong solution, then it's interim optimal. And that's not a difficult proof, so I will skip it. But it's also this property is reflected in the next result, which is more interesting, which is answering the question, when is the ex-ante solution? When is basically Bayesian persuasion, plain vanilla, an interim solution or interim optimal? And the one answer is that if an ex-ante optimal mechanism is exposed incentive compatible, so it's fully revealing, then it is interim optimal and an equilibrium of the interim information design game. So the ex-ante optimal mechanism is, of course, undominated. And if it's ex-post optimal, it's a strong solution. And a strong solution is neutral optimum, is interim optimal, and an equilibrium. So in a case where we have full disclosure being ex-ante optimal, interim optimal is also, it's also interim optimal. So that basically says that if ex-ante optimal is ex-post optimal, it's also interim optimal. So that's good, like kind of a sort of check. And the next thing I'm going to say in the last is that there is a large class of Bayesian persuasion problems that have two actions, and they have sort of, the designer has sort of a, so let's say approve, vote yes, vote no, and the designer likes more yeses than nos. And there is some complementarity in the yeses or investment or not, investment decisions or attack decisions like global games. And in all of those settings where we have some complementarity in the actions and state independent preferences for the designer, then an ex-ante optimal mechanism is interim optimal and therefore an equilibrium of the interim information design game. And I stop because this is our picture and this is sort of a summary. Thank you for the extra time, Francesco.
Vasiliki, maybe you can leave the picture there a second. I think that would help.
Yes, this picture is basically putting our solution, basically the interim optimality compares to other concepts. And of course, pictures all only refers to our particular informed principle problem, not to all informed principle problems, because we have papers where SMP exists and super exists and so forth. So our setting is basically a setting where we have moral hazard. And maybe I should have pointed out that the literature maybe I should have put some papers there. It includes a paper of Thomas on moral hazard, where actually, I think you do have existence there of SMP. So these are important results: the definition and existence and equilibrium.
Okay, Thomas, Simone, does either one of you want to add some comments, please?
I wrote down a bunch of things, so maybe I will send Vasiliki an email later. But one question that I had, maybe that may clarify, is when you define credible beliefs and blocking, those two objects are linked to each other, right? So it has the nature of a fixed point between the deviation mechanism and the belief, the credible belief that supports it, right?
Yes.
And are you, is the definition looking at the most tempting deviation for the principle, in the sense, is it implicit that you will have to satisfy that there is no desire to deviate for the best possible deviation mechanism new together with the corresponding supporting belief? Or any pair?
So here the way we define it is that there is no mechanism new and a belief such that new is feasible given this belief, and it gives strictly more to all types on the support of Q.
Yeah, so it looks like the soup over those pairs. I mean, the other inequality should hold when you take the soup over pairs of new and Qs.
I think
I mean?
I think you're saying something subtle and I'm not.
So you're saying there is no such pair for which you have a strict inequality in the direction that you write, which is, I think, equivalent to say, for any such pair, the inequality should be reversed and be a weak inequality, which means that the weak inequality has to hold also when you take the sup over the pairs nu and q. So in other words, you could say, first characterize what is
Frederic,
the envelope of the...
Yes, I think it's correct. So in the definition, so you can imagine, and it's also true in the equilibrium, how we prove it. So there exists a belief such that whatever the continuation equilibrium, you will not have an incentive to deviate. So even if the designer is optimistic about the continuation equilibrium, you will not have an incentive to deviate, yes. So that's already a refinement of perfect Bayesian equilibrium, because you can support some perfect Bayesian equilibria where you say if you deviate, given some belief, we will play the worst case equilibrium for you. So then you will support more equilibria. So yes, you can, both in the definition of interim optimality and indeed in the proof of it's a perfect Bayesian equilibrium, it's more general than what we have. There exists a belief such that whatever the continuation equilibrium, no type has an incentive to deviate. Yes, that's the question basically, right?
Yeah. We've still the requirement that these beliefs are credible, so you restrict a little bit. Thank you.
Is there still time?
Yes, please.
Yes, Thomas, yes.
I just want to say, I like very much your equilibrium construction that you have just shown to us. I mean, correct me, but it seems to me this is really a fundamentally new type of construction relative to what we have seen in the informed principle literature. I mean, we usually see equilibrium construction using these auxiliary games, as you also have, where you just compare a reference payoff vector with one particular deviating mechanism. That's what you also do. But in your case, really, in your auxiliary game, the principal chooses a type which she actually cannot do in the real interaction. So in the real interaction, she cannot lie about her type, but in your construction, she freely chooses the type, and that gives you exactly the right contradiction and the right construction. So this really seems very nice to me, and I would like to understand how general that idea really is. So, for example, probably if the agents also have private information, I would guess that this idea may still work. I mean, I would like to understand better how general this idea works.
Yes, we definitely can. Yes, it works with the agent's private information, and actually we have that done, and we are working now on a follow-up project.
That seems reasonable. Very good.
Which puts more the emphasis on the informational asymmetry and less on the recommendations and the obedience constraints. And then we can do other explorations there. So hopefully at some point we will have something to share. Yes, but this idea generalizes definitely there.
Okay. We're basically coming to the end of the official time. I wonder if there's anybody who wants to ask a quick question.